Hello and welcome to another episode of Christian Square, where pastors and professors come to discuss topics that are relevant to the church today. I'm Christian Mishagna, and I'm with my co-host, Christian Fahey. And on this episode, we have as our guest, Dr. Richard Middleton, who serves as a professor of biblical worldview and exegesis at Northeastern Seminary and at Roberts Wesleyan University. Tonight, we'll be discussing Dr. Middleton's book, Abraham's Silence, The Binding of Isaac, The Suffering of Job, and How to Talk Back to God. Dr. Middleton, welcome to this episode. Can you please just give us a brief kind of explanation of the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, and how your understanding challenges the traditional evangelical reading of this account?
Sure. So the story that Christians often call the sacrifice of Isaac, or the near sacrifice of Isaac, in Genesis 22, first 19 verses, is known in the Jewish tradition as the binding of Isaac. And the word for binding is Akedah, from the verb to bind, which occurs in the text when Abraham ties him up and puts him on the altar. Now, the traditional interpretation which evangelicals have is no different from the interpretation that every Christian has traditionally had, or even the Jewish tradition has had. That is, that God is testing Abraham to see, does he love God more than his son? Because Abraham has not had a child for a long time. He finally receives the child of promise, Isaac. The question is, will he give him up for God? So then it becomes a sort of a parable in the way we preach it, to say, would you give up anything in your life for God? Or will you cling to it despite, and put it ahead of God's love? So do you love something that is creaturely created rather than love the creator? That's a traditional reading. My reading is very different. You see, that reading assumes that the story in chapter 22 comes as the culmination of a narrative arc about the promise of a son, the delay of the promise because Sarah doesn't have any children, she's barren, to use the traditional term, and finally they have a child, and the child is born. And that should be the end of the story, but then comes the Akedah. Are you willing to give him up as a test? I don't think that makes any sense. And in fact, the narrative arc that I look at is the arc of Abraham's growing and declining relationship to God. Because Abraham has been called out from Mesopotamia, a pagan land where he was an idolater, most likely. And he had to learn about this God who called him. He knew nothing about God. He had to learn that this God was not like the deities of the nations around, who all required, in some way or another, child sacrifice to prove your commitment to the God. But this God doesn't require that. And he actually wants Abraham to be in a genuine relationship of mutuality. And so as you follow the story, each time God speaks to Abraham and Abraham responds, he is growing in his understanding of God. Let me give you an example. In chapter 15, God says, I am your reward and very great shield. And Abraham says, how's that? Because I don't have any children. So what kind of reward is that? And God says, okay, let me encourage you. Come outside and look at the stars. Can you count them? That's how many your seed, your children will be. And Abraham believes God, and it's accounted to him as righteousness. And then God says, and I'm going to give you this land. And Abraham says, okay, hang on a sec. How do I know I'm going to get this land? That's the other promise, right? And God explains that it's going to be a long time, and his people were going to be in bondage, and then they will come out of bondage in Egypt, and then they will get the land. And God gives this very famous covenant ceremony where Abraham has to cut some animals in two and wait and drive off the birds of prey. So he's got something to do, but primarily it's God who, in a smoking fire pot, it's a really strange vision, passes through the midst of these and says, I pledge to you that you will receive the land. And we know this is an ancient ritual from the ancient Near East. It occurs a couple of other times in the Bible. And the idea is that you are swearing, cross my heart and hope to die. If I do not fulfill my oath, I will be like these animals cut in half. So God is saying, okay, you challenged me on my promises. That's fine. I am taking your challenge seriously and responding to them. The next time this really happens in a great way is Genesis 18, where God says, shall I tell Abraham, my servant, what I'm going to do? Yeah, I'm going to tell him about what I'm going to do, or what I'm considering doing with Sodom and Gomorrah, because he is my faithful servant, and I have chosen him to teach his children and household after him the way of the Lord, which is righteousness and justice. So I want him to learn that way. I want him to learn more of my character. And so he says, the cry of Sodom has come to me, and I'm going to go down to investigate. Abraham says, you can't destroy the city if there are 40 righteous people living there, or innocent people. The same term can mean that. And he's thinking the fact that Lot, his nephew, and his family are living there. And God says, I won't destroy it for 40. He says, well, how about for 35? He said, no, I won't destroy it for 35. How about for 30? He said, no, I won't destroy it for 30. And Abraham then ups the ante, or lowers the ante, by 10 each time, and said, 30, 20. My last offer, will you destroy the city for the sake of 10 innocent people? God says no. And Abraham cuts off the conversation. God nevertheless saves Lot and his family, despite the fact that Abraham didn't even ask for that. So this is a teaching event to teach Abraham the extent of God's righteousness, which is actually merciful righteousness. Abraham doesn't learn it. So what God does in chapter 22, he said, okay, let's try again. I want him to understand how merciful I am, that I take him as a dialogue partner seriously. It will not be his nephew who might be destroyed this time. It'll be his own son. And I won't destroy him. He has to kill him. Now, if anything will get Abraham to say, Lord, you are a God who is righteous and merciful. You can't want this. Then I would have said, of course I can't. You got it. You understand. But Abraham did not. In silence, he goes to kill his son. And I have all sorts of clues in the narrative that tell me that Abraham does not really believe that God is a righteous God in the sense of a merciful God. His version of righteousness is God is a hard taskmaster. Like, I guess, the parable of the talents, where that one hid the thing in the ground. The man's a hard taskmaster. That's what he said. I guess I'm going to have to do this. And there's all kind of clues that show that Abraham is not living up to his full potential. But I won't get into any more of that detail. But that's how my version of the story diverges from the traditional. It's a test not of whether Abraham loves God more than his son. It's a test of two things. First of all, does Abraham understand that this God is a merciful God? Answer, no. And second, does Abraham could he come to love his son? Because he doesn't actually love his son.
You talk about that in the book and in some of the pre-reading material you sent on, where you're kind of arguing that Abraham was obviously very attached to Ishmael. And of course, that occasioned a lot of friction between him and Sarah, and eventually he had to get rid of his own son. And so one of the things that you bring up, and I think we put it in the pre-podcast notes, is God's asking, do you really love Isaac? Love him as much as you do. It seems to me as if God was saying, based on what you've said, is, look, you were learning when we were doing the negotiation about Sodom and righteous people, you were learning and you were coming to where I wanted you to be so that you could push back to see that I really am a merciful God. And it almost seems like now this is a regression, and yes. It's almost as if God is saying, look, am I like all these other deities? Do you really think I'm like that? Is that
I think that's right,
where you're going with it?
Yes, God has to up the ante because Abraham has regressed. Yes.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting in the idea that I've always seen it portrayed that Ishmael was laughing at Isaac. Can you just explain your take on that? I found that was one of those, if I had hair, it would have fell out kind of moments.
So this is the story where Hagar bears Ishmael, and Ishmael has grown up, and then Isaac is born, and Isaac is younger than Ishmael quite a bit. And the traditional translations say that Sarah saw Ishmael playing with Isaac. With Isaac is not in the Hebrew. It just says he was something, and there's a verb there. It's actually a verb based on the word Isaac, because Isaac means laughter. And
so it's a play on the name.
It's a play on the name. And so translations render this, he was playing with, or he was taunting, if they want to put a negative spin. Some even suggest playing sexually. The commentaries will say that he was abusing him. That's what got her upset. No, what got her upset was Ishmael was Isaacing. Yeah. He was acting in place of Isaac. And we know from earlier in the story that Ishmael was Abraham's favorite. He was very concerned about Ishmael, not at all concerned about Isaac. And so Sarah said, send the slave girl away with her child. Get rid of them, because she doesn't want them to inherit what should be Isaac's. But technically, the firstborn son is going to inherit. And she is worried about that, so she sends him away.
Interesting. I'm wondering, just looking at first at Abraham in his back and forth with God regarding Sodom, and then there was no back and forth. Essentially, God says, take your son up to a place that I'll show you, offer him as a burnt offering. And God says, yes, sir, on it. And that's it. And he just goes up, and God's like, that's not what I wanted.
Right.
But further on in other places, with Moses in Exodus 32, we talked a little bit about 1 Samuel 16. It seems to me that part of what God is after, and was after with Abraham, and he's kind of like a father. Father likes to wrestle with his sons, right? But he likes people who take him serious enough to really engage with him. I sent on a quote to the guys and to you, Dr. Middleton, from Jacob Neusner, and where he said, essentially, I didn't have all of this, but he says, if I wasn't taking somebody seriously, I'd kind of just pat him on the head and say, smile, and we'd go our merry way. But if I take somebody seriously, I give them the benefit of my criticism. And it seems to me that what God is after is for people to engage him seriously. And I come from the business world, and so negotiation is important. And what I see going on with Abraham in Genesis 18, Moses in Exodus 32, Samuel in 1 Samuel 16, is God teaching them to negotiate. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair read of some of that, or is that simplistic?
I would say that if I look at Abraham and God in Genesis 18 over Sodom, and I look at Moses and his prayers to God about the golden calf, which is Exodus 32, it's much more radical than negotiation, because negotiation is you start at two ends and you come towards an agreement. So what happens is God says, I'm going to wipe out Israel because of the golden calf. It's idolatry. They broke the second commandment. Yeah. But he tells Moses, leave me alone that I may get angry enough to wipe them out. Hint, I'm not quite angry enough yet. That's an opening. Moses says, Lord, you can't wipe them out because you're a merciful God. Forgive them their sins. God says, okay. That's not negotiation. He just agrees. Same thing with Abraham. Everything Abraham proposes, God agrees. I think the very next step you could have said, would you spare the city for the sake of Lot and his family? God said, of course I would. But
Moses got it then. Moses got it.
Moses got it.
He pushed and pushed and pushed, and it was like, yep, I'm a merciful God.
So he only pushed once
in the Akedah.
So, yeah, Moses only pushed once, and God immediately said, yes, I forgive them. And then back up in the book of Numbers, when the people are supposed to enter Kadesh Barnea, and they send the spies in, and the spies come back, we can't enter that land, and the people doubt, right? God says, I'm going to destroy them now again. And Moses said, remember the way you showed power in mercy back at the golden calf? Do it again. And God said, okay, just like that. So it becomes a paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So God is more merciful than we can imagine. I don't think a Christian should be surprised by that. After all, he went to the cross for us, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. You point out, and in the narrative that you create of maybe how Abraham could have responded to God, in that you bring up this idea: could God be using this situation to open Abraham's heart to Isaac, and could it be the effect of a trauma of having to basically cast off Hagar and Ishmael, that Abraham's heart is closed towards Isaac, or he's doesn't want to get hurt again, and you kind of deal with that a little bit in that post.
These are the kinds of questions you read when you read a narrative. It doesn't explain the psychological motivations of the people, but you have to kind of read between the lines and figure out, how would I make this into a movie? What kind of motivation would this character have? Why he would be doing what he's doing? You have to think about that. Yeah. And Abraham gets his first child finally after a long time and is very pleased with it. He doesn't really need the second child. And then the first child gets sent away. Maybe his heart gets turned against that second child at that point. Maybe it was neutral before. Then it gets turned against him. And I think that if Abraham, you see, my secondary point of the test is, the first one is, have you learned about God's mercy? The second point is, have you come to love your son? So if Abraham had prayed on behalf of Isaac, Lord, you cannot do this. Have mercy on this boy. You know what would have happened? Because I'm a father, I can imagine this. I would start to get close to him because I've stepped in the breach for him. And we would start to bond. And my son would see me defending him to the creator of the universe. We would start to have a good relationship. But as it is, you read the story carefully, Abraham returned to his servants. Isaac wasn't mentioned. Isaac doesn't show up till 2 years later when a bride is found for him. And he's living in a different place. And they never actually meet again. Abraham and Isaac never meet again after that.
That is interesting.
And can you talk about like the post PTS that Isaac, can you see that in the narrative of his life and in his family?
So you see, realistically, if a son is taken by his father on a 3-day journey, we can talk about why a 3-day journey is really important, but I'll get to that. A 3-day journey to a mountain, and then he's tied up within an altar, and he takes a knife, and he's about to kill me. And the son is like flabbergasted. And an angel speaks from heaven and says, stop, don't do anything to the boy. And that's what stops my father. What relation will I have with that person afterwards? I want to get the heck out of there.
You won't have a relationship.
Yeah, there's no relationship anymore. Whatever it was is kaput by that time. Now, Isaac, coming from a broken family, so I'll point out that Abraham returns at the end of chapter 22, verse 19, to Beersheba with his servants and lives in Beersheba. Beersheba is where Hagar is living. Sarah is living in Hebron. When she dies, Abraham travels to Hebron to bury her. They are not living together anymore, okay? This has broke, whether it's the actual incident on the mountain or the sending away of Hagar and Ishmael, I'm not sure which one, but Abraham has already begun to live in Beersheba even before this, and Hagar is in Hebron. Isaac is living somewhere else. The family is broken. The family is scattered. Isaac grows up. He gets married. They have children. They're twins. The twins are at each other's throats, basically, because there's parental favoritism going on. What kind of family is that? That's not a healthy family, okay?
No.
And then there is deception. And if you read the story, when Jacob puts on the goat hair and pretends to be Esau and deceives his father, and his father finds out, his father is absolutely horrified that he has given away the blessing. What's he going to do now? Well, you know what's important? Abraham never blesses Isaac. Later in the narrative, we are told God blessed Isaac because the father wasn't there to provide his blessing. God had to do it. So Isaac does not want that to happen with his kids. He says, I've already given the blessing to this one. What can I do? It turns out you can actually give the blessing to the second one too. He didn't know that at the time. He was worried, hyper-focused on, I have done something crazy here. And then Jacob's family grows up, and you have Joseph boasting about his role to the brothers and to the father, and the brothers turn against him and sell him into slavery. This is a totally dysfunctional family. And now, certainly, there are all kinds of events that could have led to it. But one thing I believe is really important, the Akedah. This has reverberations of trauma throughout the generations. In fact, when Jacob, the son of Isaac, goes to make a covenant with his uncle Laban, he swears by the God of Abraham and by the fear of Isaac. Fear of Isaac. That's the definition of God that he learned from his father. This is a God to be feared. Now, the word fear can have a positive and a negative connotation. It can mean righteous awe. It can also be running scared of a deity who you think might ask you to kill your son. And he had been traumatized by this event. And there are all these clues in the story that the outcome is not good. So my question is, couldn't you love God and love your son?
Sure.
Isn't that possible? Why is it an alternative? That's a bad reading of the story.
A couple of things come to mind. Number one, which is
just a couple.
Number one, the importance of not allowing yourself as a biblicist, proof texting person to just have a flat one or two dimensional reading of these biblical narratives. You have to really unpack what would be the potential backstory, and you can't have everything laid out for you. That seems paramount. The other thing is this, and I mentioned something when I was back and forth with the guys, and it may have been in the notes here. Would it be fair? God says at the end, or the angel says to Abraham, "Now I know that you fear God because you've not withheld your only son." Is there a sense where we've looked at, and you talk about this in your writing, about how you've had to fight against basically 2,000 years of devotion, a one-sided devotional interpretation of the Akedah? Okay. Is it possible that what they were saying is like, well, now I know you're really afraid of God, because you're willing to cut your son's throat, essentially. Is that fair, or would that do violence to the text?
It's not. These texts have complex levels of meaning, and there is no simple way to say this is the meaning. I'm weaving a whole narrative based on all kinds of textual clues and stuff from elsewhere in the Bible that leads me to my interpretation. But on that line, now I know you fear God, I think there is a quite charitable interpretation of that still works with my reading. Mm-hmm. Because the fear of God is a fine thing. Yeah. But the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Yeah. It's not yet wisdom. It's just a good starting point. But you need to go further. And true wisdom has to be discernment of God's character. And so fear with wisdom involves not just being afraid of God. That's legitimate. Yeah. God is awesome creator of the universe, right? Can speak on the heavens thunder. But God is also intimately involved with us, who wants us in relationship. So the true fear of God should include, I think, the love of God.
Yes.
The kind of fear that Abraham showed did not include love of God or love of his son. It was the kind of fear that could lead to his grandson saying, my father calls God the fear.
Yeah. And as a pastor in the church, do you think one of the biggest problems that we have with this interpretation or this viewpoint of the Akedah is the idea of it kind of destroys our hero worship of Old Testament figures? I was talking earlier. I remember going into a Sunday school class and they were talking about righteous Lot. And I was like, the guy that was pimping out his daughters is righteous Lot. Right. That it kind of takes these guys off their pedestal as far as Abraham, when we see, and how would you, I mean, is that where you're getting some pushback from?
That's one of the sources of pushback, that we like to idolize the good guys and the bad guys. Yeah, clearly. Mm-hmm. Now that version of the Old Testament didn't originate till approximately 100 years before Christ. That's about the first time Jews began to read the Old Testament that way. It was much more nuanced prior to that, as far as I can tell. There's a really good book on that by a Jewish author called James Kugel, and the book is called The Bible as It Was in the first century of the Common Era, up to 100 BC to 100 AD. And he says Christians and Jews began reading the Bible in a similar simplistic way, which is not the way the narratives actually tell it. So the first thing is we pull Abraham down a bit. We make him fully human. He's got his good qualities. Mm-hmm. It's good to fear God. I don't think that's a bad thing. That's not enough. The fear has to become mature fear. I think it was simplistic fear. I've had students who took courses with me on the book of Genesis. And when they finish the story, they say, you know what? These stories mean so much more to me because these people are just like me and my church folk. We're all flawed. And therefore, we can receive the love of God just as they received it. The love of God was not based on them being righteous. It came despite their flaws, and God still worked through them. It doesn't excuse their flaws, but God still works through us, and it gives me great hope. I've had student after student tell me this. So when we spend time with the details of it, people find it a helpful thing. But if you just hear this out of a church that Abraham wasn't faithful in certain ways, it raises up hackles. But I think there's another thing in the church that leads to this. It's not just that we idolize these heroes. It's also that we have internalized an idea that you cannot challenge God. Mm-hmm. So we have a subservient sense of what it means to be a human being. We do not really believe that we are the image of God, Imago Dei, created with real power in the world. And the power moves in two directions. We've been created, given rule over the earth and all the creatures of the earth to develop the world on God's behalf as emissaries. We're also given the power to turn back and face God and boldly approach the throne of grace, Hebrews, which actually happened to be in the lectionary reading for this past Sunday in my church, which is a fantastic. It wasn't preached on, they preached on the gospel text, but that's okay. So to come to God in boldness, and pray the prayers of lament in the Bible, pray like Moses, pray like Amos, pray like Jeremiah, and challenge God and shake the heavens, and God says, good, you got me. But those Christians say, oh, Lord, I'm so sorry. It's the Monty Python thing. Stop groveling. I'm so sorry. Stop saying sorry. Get up, stand up. That's what God is like. God doesn't want a groveling people. God wants people made in his image who stand up and say, Lord. I'm going to paraphrase Jeremiah and Habakkuk. They both say the same thing. They say, Lord, you are always righteous in everything you do. However, I got a bone to pick with you about what you're doing here. It's such you state what is true of God. God, you are righteous. We know that. Excuse me, but there is a problem here. Your righteousness ain't showing up. Can you explain
You deceived me. You deceived me.
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about you anymore.
And I think it's really...
God doesn't give up on them when they do that. He takes them seriously. I'm sorry. You go ahead.
I think that's part of the point of the whole book. The point of Brueggemann's message of the Psalms or whatever is that God appreciates people who take him seriously enough to push back. It's Jacob Neusner and the students he took seriously. Those who take somebody, the other, serious enough to engage them and even engage them forcefully. I think that's what you were after in the Job, when you're talking about Job at the end of the whirlwind, and you give a different reading or you suggest as a possibility, maybe what Job was saying was not repeating God. You said, I will speak. And in this particular case, Job was saying, now I'm going to say something to you. Yeah. And God appreciated that because he was upset at his friends who basically were giving transactional reasons for why this was going on. You must have offended God because this kind of stuff only happens to people who offend God. And you argue for the fact that Job stood right up and would talk as a friend to God.
Yeah. So for those who haven't read the book yet, there's 2 chapters on Job that come before I look at the Genesis story. And even those Christians who have pushed back on my reading of Abraham tend to like my reading of Job. In fact, my first foray into the material for this book was I gave a presentation on Job's response to God at the end of the second speech from the whirlwind at an academic conference. 25-minute presentation. And this scholar comes up to me, an Old Testament scholar, pretty liberal, critical scholar, and said, you have just rescued God for me. Mm-hmm. And it's changed my view of God. And he invited me to come to his university and give a public lecture on it.
That's high praise.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, and I'll tell you, with Abraham, though challenging kind of the traditional church view, kind of maybe demystifies or takes Abraham down a notch, but it makes God so much desirable. Yes. One of the big problems I have as a pastor is the continuity or the discontinuity of the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. And when here you have a God in the Old Testament that is kind of this, angry, this puts God in a much different light where we can stand before him and push back and dialogue or have our day in court, if you could say, with God.
Yeah.
It makes God much more, well, obviously approachable.
Yeah.
More
So
wisdom.
here I'm going to recommend a book that's coming out in a month or so by a Jewish friend of mine. His name is Shai Held, and you probably seen one of the articles. He responded to my book.
Yeah,
he doesn't
he
quite
did.
agree
Yeah,
my
okay.
interpretation, but he is one of the most profound Jewish thinkers I know today. A youngish fellow, younger than I am anyway. His father was Moshe Held, who was a famous scholar of Ugaritic literature. Not a believer in God, a secular Jew, but this guy is a very compassionate, passionate Jew who has just written a book called Judaism is About Love. And it challenges the misconception of God in the Old Testament. He uses the term the Old Testament because I'm talking with Christians too, right? And one of the things that I get in a lot of contexts, he says, when I speak about God and I do my teaching, is I get Jewish students or Jewish synagogue members who say, but that's a Christian idea. He says, no, they got it from us. Rabbi Jesus was simply quoting the Hebrew scriptures.
Yes.
And he points this out. And it's a beautiful book to revamp the idea. You know, we've been told Judaism is religion of law, Christianity, religion of love. That's not true at all.
No.
I mean, biblical scholars all know that's not true. And he's become a biblical scholar. He started out as basically a scholar of Jewish ethics and tradition, did his dissertation at Harvard on the John Levinson, the famous Old Testament scholar, wrote his dissertation on Abraham Joshua Heschel, the whole theology of Heschel.
Prophets,
Brilliant book. And now we've become a biblical scholar of the first rate. And he and I dialogue all the time, and we're pretty much on track most of the time. He's still a little more suspicious that my reading of Abraham doesn't quite work, he says. I'd like it to work, he says, but he's not sure. But then I give a response to him, and I don't know what he thinks now. And maybe I've convinced him.
Do you think that part of the reason you talked about having to really kind of fight against 2,000 years of a one-sided interpretation of the binding, part of it is the fact that Christians, especially in the last probably 150 years, have really tended to make that a really devotional thing. And it's almost divorced from its Near Eastern context and all the kind of stuff that's actually going on in that context all those years ago.
Yeah. So classical Jewish tradition, rabbinic tradition, reads the point of the text, the application of the text, as Abraham offered or tried to offer sacrifice at Mount Moriah. Moriah, in the book of Chronicles, it's claimed that is a place where the Jewish temple was built. That Solomon built the temple. So what Abraham was doing was instituting sacrifice and burnt offerings are offered twice a day in the temple when it was existing. So he was trying to give a burnt offering of his son. So that's the basis. But then when the temple stopped existing, Abraham's dedication to God to offer his son could be the motivation for us to pray to God now that there are no more sacrifices. So just as God stopped the sacrifice, it wasn't necessary. Sacrificial system is over for Jews now. We don't need that. We can just pray to God. So they view this as the grounding of Jewish devotion to God, whether in sacrifice or in prayer.
Okay.
The Christian reading, which I learned growing up, is you should be willing to give up anything for God.
Same here.
I don't know. This is one of those cases where if the principle is right, but how can you get it from that text? So if you love your son more than God, should you go kill your son to prove it? No. We'll say no. Of course we will say no. But then don't you realize the disconnect between that general principle and this text? This text couldn't be teaching that. It's got to be something else.
Yeah. I thought your imaginative reading of what Abraham, had he pushed back, might have set. I wasn't sure when I saw, okay, this is, I've read things by Ed Friedman where he's written parables, for his therapy clients and so forth. And it's usually sardonic. And I'm reading this, as I read through it, I thought, yeah, this is viable. I could see this going on. I could see Abraham saying, Master of the universe, you can't possibly mean for me to kill my own son. I thought it was effective.
So what you're thinking of is the conclusion of the article I wrote. It's not actually in the book. It's in response to the 9 papers criticizing the book or affirming the book, and I gave at the very end. Here is a possible way that Abraham could have prayed.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
And I've given you a copy that you can post for your folks to read if you want to make it widely available, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to point out, though, is some of the reasons within the text itself that I wonder about Abraham and want to be critical of him. Because there is a point where I mentioned the 3 days. Go a 3-day journey, and I will tell you. And the Jewish tradition, which is very interested in pushing back against God, as you said, but not consistently. It's sporadic in the Jewish tradition. Some of the scholars will say it's 3 days because Abraham is giving God a chance to change his mind. Except it's God who said, go a 3-day journey. God could have said, sacrifice your son right here. He said, go a 3-day journey. He's giving Abraham a chance to think about it and challenge God.
Oh, wow.
See, otherwise it doesn't make sense. Why a 3-day journey to this place, right? So, but on the journey, they come to a place and they stop, and Abraham and the son, he puts he gets the wood off the donkey, puts it on his son's back, and he takes the knife from the fire pot, and he tells the servants, the boy and I are going to go up there and worship, and we will come back to you. Question: does Abraham believe that? I don't think he believes it at all. And in fact, in the Jewish Midrashic tradition in the Middle Ages, many Jewish rabbis said what Abraham meant was he would bring Isaac's bones back.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Or he was just lying and dissembling. Otherwise, the servants would have tried to stop him.
Yeah.
So he had to tell them something. And there are all these ways. Now, here is the thing. As they go on, there's a very touching moment when Isaac says, my father? And Abraham says, yes, my son. And he says, here is the fire and the knife. Sorry, the fire and the wood. He doesn't mention the knife. It's like his eyes are averted from the knife. Sure, But where is a lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham says, God himself will provide or see to the lamb, my son. That's called 2 nouns in apposition. The lamb, comma, my son. It's actually very ambiguous. And again, the Midrashic tradition has caught up the ambiguity. And you find a Midrash on it from the Middle Ages that says, and Abraham says, God will provide the lamb, or you will be the lamb, my son.
Yeah.
But he makes it very explicit. Yeah. But Abraham, so the question is, does Abraham actually think God will provide a substitute? Now, it turns out to be not a lamb, but a ram. But when Abraham gets to the mountain, he does not look for a substitute. The ram is already tied up. In fact, the ram has been there for so long, according to Jewish tradition, that it was tied up on the 2nd day of creation, waiting for Abraham. That's actually the Jewish tradition. That's how merciful God was. He didn't want to kill his son. He provided the ram. Now, I think that's overstating it, right? But a ram, a ram is a goat with these huge horns, from which you get shofar. And the horns were caught in a bush. Now, imagine a ram, a male animal full of testosterone, struggling to get free.
Sure.
Abraham doesn't notice it. He is not even looking for anything. He's so hyper-focused on, I have to kill this boy. Like God told me to. I better do it because this is the God. I got to do it. And he goes to kill. And the angel says, stop, don't do anything to the boy. Then Abraham looks up and sees the ram, which has been there all the time. And on his own initiative, he takes the ram and sacrifices it instead of his son. There. He did a good thing.
Yeah.
That is actually praiseworthy.
Sure.
That he, on his own initiative, said, okay, I can sacrifice the ram instead. But he had to be stopped by the angel because he did not look around, which tells me he wasn't expecting the son to be rescued at all.
No.
Not within the parameters of the story.
Unbelievable. Wow.
Oh.
Wow.
You've just destroyed years of flannel graphs in churches.
But it's okay to destroy that if you elevate God as a result. So when the angel then, in the second speech from the world, not from the world, but from heaven, says, okay, because you have done this thing and not withheld your son, your only one, leaving out the phrase whom you love, because it's clear he doesn't love him, right? Mm-hmm. The angel twice uses that phrase, your son, your only one, and doesn't say whom you love, because you haven't withheld him. I will surely bless you and your descendants after you to give you this land and to increase them and all this kind of stuff, which is fascinating. Genesis 12, God promises Abraham on oath that he is going to have descendants and inherit a land, and he will bless his descendants. Well, actually, the way God puts it in Genesis 12 is, I will bless you. In Genesis 18, he also says, I will bless you. But he says something different. He says, I want to bless you based on your understanding of my righteousness and justice.
Mm-hmm.
But Abraham doesn't understand it. So the test comes. Well, if God wants to bless him now based on his righteousness and justice, how can he do it? Because Abraham doesn't get it. So when the angel says, I will surely bless, he doesn't say you now. For the first time, he says your seed, your descendants. Now, God could not bless his descendants if Isaac had been killed. That's the first thing that I noticed. So there's a change in the promise. But most interpreters say God is now making the blessing dependent on Abraham's obedience. No, God wanted to make it dependent on Abraham's obedience in chapter 18. It didn't work. And Abraham is not obedient here. And so he's going to bless him despite his misunderstanding. So it's going to revert to an unconditional blessing. And I point out that there are at least 4 places in the Old Testament, and I won't get into it right here, where first God says, I want you to do X, Y, Z. The people fail. So God says, I will do X, Y, Z for you to make up for your lack, which is basically the Christian interpretation of what the cross is about. We are supposed to be righteous. We have failed. So Christ has come to be that righteousness and to die for us, that we may now receive the righteousness. So God is compensating for Abraham's deficiency by saying, I will surely bless your descendants. Now, I know it's almost impossible, almost, emphasize the word almost, put it in red, italics, and capital letters and underline it. It's almost impossible for anybody reading that to say, God is making up for deficiency? No, God is rewarding Abraham by wanting to bless his descendants. But that's only because we read it that way for 2,000 years. Nothing in the text actually suggests that. And I point out there are these 4 other cases where God first says, do this, they fail. Then he says, I will do this for you. It's a standard approach within the Old Testament.
Yeah, well, you made the point, I think, in your pre-reading material about the promise of the new heart. You get the new heart, new spirit, and then he says, I'm going to do it.
Ezekiel, get yourself a new heart and new spirit. Okay, I'll give you a new heart and new spirit. Keep the covenant and write the laws in your heart. You can't? Okay, I'll write the laws in your heart. On and on it goes this way, Or I like the Deuteronomy one. Circumcise the foreskin of your heart. They fail. He says, I will circumcise the foreskin of your heart. What a gracious God.
That's incredible. I can almost see echoes of something that happened in the ministry of Jesus, where they had gone into a region of Samaria and they didn't receive him. And so James and John says, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? And Jesus turned and he rebuked them. He says, which happened in the Old Testament with Elijah. He says, you don't know what spirit you're of. I didn't come here to destroy men's lives, but to save. You could almost see if Jesus were there. I'm speaking. If you were to take Jesus of Nazareth back in time as a theophany, he'd say, Abraham, you're not even getting this. You've got the wrong idea about what God is really like. So there's all that chesed in the Old Testament that was there. It wasn't the Old Testament, as you were saying earlier, the Old Testament was just about law and the New Testament about grace. The Old Testament was just about wrath, and the New Testament is about kindness. It was there all along.
Yeah. I confess that I find my primary spirituality through the Old Testament, and then through the New Testament, once that lens is there. And I know that the way that the Bible is taught in many colleges and churches and seminaries is the New Testament is the basis for our spirituality. The Old Testament is just a historical oddity. It gives us information about the past. No, it actually teaches us about who God is.
Yeah, that's true. That's good.
Yeah, and that's so needed today in the church as a pastor. Introducing people to the Old Testament, they're like, I don't like this God back there. Because I think they misinterpreted actually what's going on.
Yeah. And of course, there is wrath in the New Testament too.
Mm-hmm.
Should
And
be.
wrath,
Yeah.
wrath is not something separate from God's love. It's an aspect of God's love. A God of love cannot tolerate injustice and must deal with injustice. That's where wrath comes in. And judgment is an essential part. If you let evil people get away with their evil, that's not love.
No.
For the people who suffer at their hands, yeah.
Very good. Wow.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I think part of my right now, I'm sorry, it was just such a paradigm shift in so many things that the way we've been taught for years, and just thank you for challenging that, and thank you for introducing us to an Old Testament view of God that just makes him so much more endearing. So I just would like to thank everybody for tuning in and checking out Christian Squared. A big shout out to our guest tonight, Dr. Richard Middleton. Links to his website and his blog and the materials that were mentioned tonight will be posted on our website and Facebook page. I would also invite you to like and to share what's going on here at Christian Squared, and also remind you that Christian Squared is sponsored by New Life CNY, which is a gospel-centered church looking to help people learn to live life through the power of the gospel, located in Syracuse, New York.